3006 Springfield. The 3006 Springfield was the absolute backbone of the American defense in 1950. This cartridge functioned as the heavyweight champion of the U.S. arsenal, a veteran of 2 world wars that refused to retire from the front lines. It provided the visceral thunder behind the M1 Garand, launching a 150-grain bullet at a blistering muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second. The technical genius of the 3006 lay in its brutal kinetic energy and high-pressure ballistic profile. Generating over 2,800 foot-pounds of force, it could punch through thick brush and helmet steel at ranges exceeding 500 yards with ease. On the rugged, vertical terrain of the Korean peninsula, this long-range capability acted as a vital lifeline for UN forces. While smaller rounds struggled with wind drift in deep, unpredictable valleys, the 3006 remained a laser-focused hammer against enemy positions. Interestingly, many soldiers during the Chosin Reservoir campaign discovered a hidden advantage. The massive recoil energy was essential for cycling the M1 Garand's gas system even when frozen solid at 30 degrees Fahrenheit. While lighter calibers suffered from constant short stroking in the brutal cold, the 3006 had enough thump to overcome frozen grease and keep the rifle running. It represented a brutal, over-engineered solution for an unforgiving environment where reliability meant the difference between life and death. By the time the first shots echoed at Osan, the 3006 had already cemented its legacy as the gold standard of 20th-century individual firepower. 7.62 x 54mm R. The Soviet 7.62 x 54mm R stands as a defiant middle finger to modern ballistic evolution, proving that a 1891 design could dominate a mid-20th century battlefield. While Americans refined their rimless 3006, the East clung to this flanged dinosaur, utilizing a protruding rim for head spacing and extraction. This mechanical simplicity turned the Mosin Nagant and DP-27 into unkillable workhorses on the frozen ridges of North Korea. Its 148-grain projectile sliced through mountain air with a flat trajectory, offering North Korean marksmen a terrifying reach that rivaled any Western sniper. The defining moment occurred when the mercury plummeted to 30 degrees Fahrenheit, a temperature that effectively turned high-tech Western firearms into expensive clubs. Because the 54R was engineered with loose, sloppy tolerances, it continued to cycle flawlessly while American rifles seized up from frozen lubrication and tight internal parts. This meant that in the most brutal environments, the simpler technology held the ultimate advantage. Communist snipers could operate with total confidence, knowing their rimmed cartridges would extract every single time regardless of ice or grit. Beyond its cold weather reliability, the 54R provided a level of raw, punchy kinetic energy that commanded respect. It was a round built for endurance, capable of functioning in the muddiest trenches. By 1953, this rimmed veteran had proven that in total war, reliability is far more valuable than theoretical perfection. 7.62 x 25mm Tokarev. At the heart of human wave assault sat the 7.62 x 25mm Tokarev, a bottlenecked pistol cartridge behaving like a miniature lightning bolt. Unlike slow, heavy .45 caliber rounds, the Tokarev focused on extreme velocity, propelling an 85-grain bullet at nearly 1,600 feet per second. Loaded into a 71-round drum of a PPS H-41, it transformed a soldier into a mobile firestorm. This high-pressure round was a specialist in penetration, zipping through thick winter overcoats and barriers that would stop standard handgun bullets. U.S. infantrymen developed a visceral dread of the burp gun because the Tokarev's insane muzzle velocity combined with a 900-round-per-minute fire rate made a burst sound like a single, hauntingly long human belch. In the pitch-black night, this sound usually preceded an overwhelming flood of Chinese volunteers. The Tokarev wasn't designed for precision. It was a tool for absolute saturation at 25 yards. In the claustrophobic confines of a trench, the volume of high-velocity lead could suppress an entire squad in seconds. This represented a shift toward high-cadence, short-range lethality that UN forces were initially unprepared for. While a GI might have a more accurate rifle, the Chinese soldier had a drum full of armor-piercing energy. This tiny cartridge proved that in close combat, speed and capacity often outweigh pure stopping power. 30 Carbine. The .30 carbine was the American military's ambitious attempt to bridge the gap between a clumsy handgun and a heavy battle rifle. Weighing just 5 pounds, the M1 carbine fired a 110-grain round-nose bullet at 1990 feet per second, offering far more reach than a .45 ACP for support troops. This ergonomic masterstroke allowed paratroopers to carry 300 rounds of ammunition in the same space a Garand rifleman carried 80, fundamentally rewriting the rules of individual firepower logistics. It was a sleek, high-capacity answer to modern mobility, yet the frozen ridges of 1950 turned this technical success into a source of bitter controversy. A dark myth began to circulate among exhausted GIs. The .30 carbine was supposedly bouncing off the thick frozen cotton uniforms of charging Chinese infantry. While laboratory ballistics proved the round could still punch through wood at 100 yard, the psychological damage on the front lines was irreparable. Soldiers lost faith in their little .30, fearing its round nose design lacked the kinetic thump needed to stop a determined enemy at close range. In reality, the 30-degree below-zero temperatures likely caused inconsistent powder burns, leading to catastrophic velocity drops. When fighting moved into the narrow 50-yard confines of a trench, the .30 carbine remained a lethal defensive tool, but it left the war shadowed by the ghosts of those frozen hills. 82mm mortar shell. When the brutal verticality of the Korean ridges rendered individual small arms useless, the infantry turned to the 82mm mortar. These 7-pound projectiles were the primary instrument of Chinese tactical fire, capable of being carried by hand up peaks that no heavy artillery could ever reach. Technically, the shell utilized a simple impact detonation fuse and propellant increments attached to its tail fins to create a high arcing trajectory. This allowed the Chinese to drop death directly into narrow valleys and hidden foxholes where flat firing guns were physically incapable of reaching. It was the birth of the pocket artillery doctrine. The true terror of the 82mm shell wasn't just the blast, but its psychological acoustic profile. As it plummeted from its 2,000-yard apex, the air rushing over the fins created a blood-curdling hiss. This sound gave every soldier below exactly 2 seconds to find cover, becoming a persistent nightmare for UN troops holding the line. Even if the explosion missed, the constant threat of these whistling shells caused a level of combat fatigue that broke the strongest wills. By saturating the front with hundreds of these portable explosives, the Chinese proved that high-angle fire was the ultimate equalizer in mountain warfare. It remains a masterclass in using low-tech efficiency to shatter the organized defenses of a modern superpower. 3.5-inch rocket, MM-28A2 heat. In early 1950, American infantry felt helpless as North Korean T-34 tanks shrugged off old 2.36-inch bazooka rounds like raindrops. The desperate solution arrived in the form of the 3.5-inch rocket, specifically the M28A2 high-explosive anti-tank heat projectile. This massive 9-pound rocket utilized the shaped charge principle, focusing a jet of molten copper that could burn through 11-inch of solid armor plate. Technically, it didn't rely on velocity to kill. The explosive energy itself forced its way through steel, turning the tank's interior into a furnace of shrapnel. The arrival of this rocket at the front lines was more than just a hardware upgrade. As first T-34s began to erupt into catastrophic pillars of fire from 200 yards away, the 3.5-inch rocket became the defining turning point that restored the American infantryman's confidence in his ability to stop a tank. It shattered the myth of communist armored invincibility, turning hunters into the hunted overnight. During the defense of the Pusan perimeter, these rockets allowed small super bazooka teams to hold back entire armored columns. By providing the individual soldier with the power to destroy the most formidable vehicle, the 3.5-inch rocket fundamentally reshaped the dynamics of anti-tank warfare. It was a victory of chemical energy over heavy steel, proving a man on foot could still dominate the king of battle. 7. 85mm tank shell, BR-365. During the opening act of the war, the 85mm BR-365 shell was the lightning bolt that struck fear into Task Force Smith. Fired from the T-34-85, this armor-piercing capped round weighed nearly 20 pounds and achieved a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second. The BR-365 represented a perfect technical equilibrium, offering enough mass to crush armor on impact, while maintaining a high enough velocity to ensure a flat, accurate flight path over 1,000 yards. At the Battle of Osan, American GIs watched in horror as their light tanks were torn apart by these rounds, which could penetrate the thin armor of an M24 Chaffee from almost any angle. The shock of the 85mm shell forced the U.S. military to rethink its entire armored strategy in the Pacific. It wasn't just about the shell's penetration. It was the synergy between the round's lethality and the tank's mobility. Because the 85mm was so effective, North Korean tankers could remain aggressive, outranging early UN responses. This shell turned the T-3485 into a mobile fortress that dominated the landscape until the arrival of much heavier American M26 Pershing. It remains a masterclass in mid-century tank gunnery, showing how a well-balanced projectile can dictate the pace of an entire invasion. For the first few months, the 85mm shell was the undisputed ruler of Korean roads, a heavy-hitting reminder that Soviet armor technology was second to none. 50 BMG. The 50 BMG remains the undisputed heavyweight of the machine gun world, a cartridge so dominant it redefined long-range suppression. During the Korean War, specialized armor-piercing incendiary (API) rounds became the standard, capable of punching through engine blocks and light fortifications at distances exceeding 1,000 yards. Fired from the legendary M2 Browning, these 700-grain projectiles delivered a staggering 13,000 foot-pounds of muzzle energy, making them the ultimate tool for holding high-ground outposts against massed infantry. U.S. troops relied on this Ma-deuce to sweep entire hillsides, where the mere impact of these rounds could disintegrate makeshift stone cover and light vehicles. It is a profound testament to John Browning's engineering that despite over 100 years of ballistic advancement, the fundamental design of the 50 BMG remains virtually unchanged since its 1921 inception. In a conflict that saw the birth of the jet age, the military still turned to this World War I-era giant to do the heaviest lifting on the battlefield. The secret lay in a perfect technical balance of mass and velocity, a combination so effective that modern ballistic engineers still struggle to find a superior replacement for its weight class. Whether disrupting enemy supply convoys or acting as the final line of defense during night raids, the 50 BMG proved that some ballistic designs are simply born perfect. 105mm artillery shell. If the infantry was the soul of the UN defense, the 105mm M1 high-explosive shell was its iron fist. This 42-pound projectile contained roughly 5 pounds of high-grade TNT, designed to fragment into thousands of lethal shards upon impact. U.S. artillerymen perfected the time-on-target (TOT) tactic, a mathematical masterpiece where multiple batteries fired at different intervals so that every single shell landed at the exact same second. This created an instantaneous, localized apocalypse that could erase an entire battalion before the first explosion's echo even faded. The sheer scale of this devastation was only possible because of the staggering industrial might behind the front lines. The true backbone of the UN strategy was the relentless power of U.S. logistics, with individual batteries often firing over 2,000 rounds per day to blunt the human wave attacks that threatened to overrun their positions. This meant that for every charging enemy soldier, there were hundreds of pounds of steel and high explosives waiting in the sky. The 105mm shell transformed the landscape of Korea, turning lush hills into cratered moonscapes. It wasn't just a weapon of destruction, it was a weapon of industrial exhaustion, proving that in modern total war, the side with the most efficient supply chain usually dictates the terms of engagement. 20mm autocannon shell. The final chapter of Korean ammunition history was written in the thin air of MiG Alley, at speeds that shattered Second World War dogfighting traditions. As the war transitioned into the jet age, the traditional 50 caliber machine gun reached its lethal limits, forcing the U.S. to deploy the 20mm autocannon. These shells acted as miniature artillery pieces, equipped with high explosive charges, designed to cripple a Soviet-built MiG-15 with a single hit. While the MiGs carried massive 23mm and 37mm cannons, the American F-86 Sabre relied on the rapid-fire 20mm to overcome the incredible structural durability of its communist rivals. Combat became a terrifying blur of physics, where two jet fighters would hurtle toward each other at a combined closing velocity exceeding 1,200 miles per hour, leaving pilots only fractions of a 1 second to lead their target and fire. At these transonic speeds, the 20mm shell required perfect stabilization to maintain accuracy amidst the violent turbulence of jet exhaust and thin air. This shift toward autocannons marked the definitive end of the propeller era and the beginning of modern aerial warfare. The 20mm shell didn't just down planes, it proved that the future of combat belonged to whoever could deliver high explosive fire at the speed of sound. From the frozen trenches of Osan to the supersonic skies of the Yalu River, these 10 rounds defined a war where 19th century grit met the raw power of the industrial age.